Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Welcome to the latest round of the 2022 Formula One World Championship for round number 2 at the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. The Jeddah Corniche Circuit here has 27 corners, and given that at, say, 50% race distance, we'll be doing 25 laps here today. That means we have more corners than we do laps. Take a look at this then. 27 turns of this 3.8 mile circuit, 6.1 kilometers, with then 3 DRS zones around this circuit. 27 corners, as you see there, lining up with that final hairpin at the end of the lap, where of course we saw big action in last year's race with Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton battling it out with that infamous collision between the two championship protagonists. Let's take a look at our grid then here today to get us started. It's an all-Ferrari front row with last time's winner Charles Leclerc taking pole position with their teammate Carlos Sainz alongside. Then for the rest of our grid we have an all Red Bull second row, all Mercedes third row, and then all Alpine for the fourth row. And then, would you believe it, all McLaren for the 5th row. Then we start to get a bit of variation. Bottas in 11th, Schumacher in 12th, Tsunoda in 13th, Gilligan going one better than last time, 14th this time round. Gasly and then Magnussen doing well as well, getting 15th and 16th. Albon, Vettel in 17th and 18th, with then Zhou Guanyu and Nicholas Latifi at the back of the grid. Although it should be noted that for Zhou Guanyu's Alfa Romeo, they did have a penalty there, which then forced them back down the grid. There are no rivers located in Saudi Arabia, as our handy tooltip in the bottom of your screen there will tell you. But around this circuit then, this of course had its wonderful debut last year. This year's race though, there were doubts that it would happen at all, with the likes of the issues during Friday practice where there were explosions not too far from the circuit. The drivers held a bit of a protest on Friday evening, and so eventually were talked round, and so qualifying happened, and now our race will happen. Max Verstappen there, ready to get going. So then, all the cars lined up on the grid, the formation lap is complete. And now then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 red lights. Lights out, and away we go. And it looks like a good start for the two Ferraris up at the front of the field, but an even better start it looks like for Sergio Perez in the background. Max Verstappen, though, has been able to go around the outside of their teammate. Will they now defend that round the inside of turn number 2? No, Perez looks to get all the way around the outside. And look at this now. Perez has been able to get themselves up into P3 in this one, down towards the next turn, then through the left-hander they go. Verstappen's going to keep trying to bring it round the outside. The two Ferraris are starting to run away with it with this battle going on behind them, and Verstappen has to settle for second best of the two Red Bulls. Then comes Esteban Ocon, having a bit of a gap now from themselves to to their teammate Fernando Alonso, just in front and under threat from the two McLarens behind. Ricciardo's been able to jump Norris at the start there, and as we head down into the great big banked left-hander here at the end of the first sector, it looks like things staying as they are now in the top 10. And then here we can see then Yuki Tsunoda has been jumped by Gilligan at the start, but Gilligan has lost a bit of ground to Valtteri Bottas. A bit of a larger gap opening up between those two drivers than where we're seeing most in the field, majority of the field. Only about 1 or 2 tenths between each car. But for Gilligan, 6 tenths of a gap. Ocon to Alonso, 8 tenths of a gap. And then for Perez up to Sainz, 1.6 seconds already on this first lap that isn't even complete yet. As we head through a bit wide there for Gilligan, that's going to bring them under pressure from Tsunoda. Just behind then, no DRS just yet, of course. We'll see it on that straight that the drivers are coming onto now. And look at this, it's Verstappen versus Perez, round 2. And they've been able to get a bit of a gap there to the Mercedes behind, bit of wheel banging between the two cars as well. These Mercedes drivers looking to take advantage if they can, but these Red Bull drivers certainly much closer in terms of their fight than they were last year. Verstappen now moves to the outside down towards turn number 1. Although Perez has just got the legs on them, still just ever so slightly ahead as they defend into the first corner and then swing it round the outside in turn number 2. Brilliant bit of racing from Sergio Perez, holding off their one-time world champion teammate Max Verstappen. Now then, Daniel Ricciardo trying it round the outside of Esteban Ocon into turn number 4. Are they going to get it done? It looks like they might. Up the inside in 5, round the outside of 6, and Ocon there just managing to get their Alpine back in front of the McLaren. Bit of a twitch there on exit for Ricciardo too, so that's not going to help them in this run down towards the hairpin. As we go down to this next corner then, the McLarens have to be careful, and I take that! Not careful at all from Lando Norris. Lando sends it up the inside. Bit of a slide on exit though. That's going to allow their teammate back through, and now Mick Schumacher is sniffing around the back of the McLaren duo, hoping to capitalise on any possible mistake there that might come about as a result of them fighting. All this scrapping between them has also allowed Gilligan to get a bit closer. They've also overtaken Bottas somewhere around the circuit, as we now take a look at Lewis Hamilton, who is getting closer and closer to their championship rival of last year, Verstappen of course. All that fighting between the Red Bulls. Again, no DRS on this lap. That will come online next lap. And so if Hamilton is able to maintain this sort of a gap throughout the rest of this and the next lap, then we should start to see some Mercedes versus Red Bull battling, which we didn't really see at all in Bahrain, of course. It was very much the Ferrari and Red Bull show in that race. But as we see them now head down the start-finish straight, Sainz has gotten very close to Leclerc as well, just 1.5 tenths separating the Ferrari drivers as they go down to turn 1. You can see them there side by side briefly. Oh, TV director, why don't you cut across to them? Instead, we're taking a look now at Gilligan versus Bottas. Down in towards turn number 1 they go. Bottas has that inside line, but Gilligan sweeps around the outside, comes the inside for turn number 2, and keeps the position just outside of the points. P12 there for the Aston driver. And their teammate Sebastian Vettel a bit further down the order just has lost 1 position off the start, down to P19 behind Zhou Guanyu. And then Kevin Magnussen also falling down the order a bit, as has Pierre Gasly. So Bottas then is really trying to make things happen here, really trying to make things work in terms of fighting back. The Alfa Romeo is a good car, we know this, but the drivers just haven't really been able to extract much out of it so far. In the last race, of course, and then, of course, so far in this race, it seems. With them really struggling to find the optimum window. It means that Zhou Guanyu's not been able to qualify particularly well, and then, of course, has had to be on the back foot in the race last time out, and certainly seems to be the case this time out as well. And then Bottas, of course, very close to the back of Gilligan once more, but Gilligan's in an Aston Martin that shouldn't really be competing that high up the field. Could be that these drivers who've got that experience of the old generation cars are then struggling to get up to speed. Maybe it would be a case that from the next race onwards they might start to be a bit more competitive with these new rookies here. But we're now watching Esteban Ocon then, who has really fallen off the back of their teammate. Alonso now still sticking with the Mercedes drivers, but 2.4 seconds. And look at that, Ocon there, under pressure from Ricciardo, suddenly loses out in the final turn. Turn 27. The place is Ricciardo's, and it might be a place for Norris as well. Look at this now. Lando Norris coming down the inside, down the start-finish straight. It's going to be tight between the two of them into turn number 1, and it's also going to be tight between them and their teammate. Daniel Ricciardo now under pressure as Lando comes round the outside in turn number 1. Surely not. Yes, he has. Lando Norris in a couple of corners has gotten a couple of positions. Brilliant bit of racing from the young Brit there. Getting that McLaren up into P8, and now then it's going to be their task to chase on after the other Alpine, that of Fernando Alonso. Meanwhile, further down the order, you can see this scrap that's going on here between Alex Albon, Kevin Magnussen, and then the rest of the gaggle of cars following them behind. With that being Zhou Guanyu, Seb Vettel, and Nicolas Latifi, all seemingly being held up by the Williams here. The Williams is the slowest car on the grid at the moment in terms of the car development. We will have some graphics to show in the coming races once the teams have had some time to develop their cars to see just how competitive they are. In the pecking order, according to our experts here at Formula One Management, but as we now start to see going down the back straights once more, then in the second sector, we've got Bottas chasing after Schumacher, who has been passed by Gilligan somewhere around the circuit as well. So the Aston is making their way up the order here, and with Ocon having seemingly a turn of bad pace these last few laps, they've been overtaken by both McLarens. They've now been dropped slightly by those two McLarens as well, despite DRS being in use. Could be potentially another point score for Gilligan here. They were on the alternate strategy last time round, benefited from the safety car, of course, as did their teammate Vettel, but Vettel not quite that high up the order after qualifying, and so they weren't able to capitalise and take the points. As it was, Gilligan managed to get a good result last time. Could be another good one here. And look at this, they could even take advantage of this scrapping going on in front of them, and it might be 3 wide into turn number 1. No, Gilligan pulls out of it, but Norris then is having to defend now. They managed to get that position on Ricciardo. Ricciardo's gotten the position back, though. And then out of that final turn, they were under threat from Esteban Ocon all the way down that start finish straight, and now on board with Gilligan. Gilligan goes up the inside on Ocon now and squeezes out the French driver in the French car. And that Aston Martin moves up into P10 in the race order. Really see what Norris is able to unleash in terms of the pace of that car when they're not under threat, having to take those lines off of the racing line there. They've been able to scamper away from Gilligan in just a few corners there. 7.5 tenths a gap now. They're starting to creep back down again, though. Or hovering around that sort of a region, at least between 7 and 7.5 tenths. Ocon now is going to have to try and stick with Gilligan here too. Otherwise, they will end up losing the DRS, and then, of course, that will mean that they will be that much more vulnerable to those cars behind, the likes of Bottas, Tsunoda and Gasly, of course. So things are very, very close between all these drivers at this stage. Bottas then we go on board with at the moment, and watch them making their way towards the back of Mick Schumacher, of course. And again, it all really is going to depend on just how close these drivers are able to stick to one another and get that benefit of DRS. At the moment, everybody, all the way from Gilligan down to Gasly is all within DRS range of the car in front. The ones who break that trend are Norris, who's 1.4 seconds off the back of Ricciardo, and, well, I was about to say Zhou Guanyu, but he's been repassed by Alexander Albon into the final turn there. So Albon now the one who's got a trailing gap to Pierre Gasly in front, 3.5 seconds here. You can really see what this DRS train is doing to these drivers behind. They're really, really stuck here and not able to really capitalise on their car's greater pace than that which Albon is capable of in the Williams. Williams clearly going for a very low drag setup for this particular race. So in the corners, they're sticking with him very well indeed. But clearly enough straight line speed in this car to allow them to then attack and defend down the big DRS straights. Back on board with Daniel Ricciardo. They've lost a couple of tenths now to Norris behind. Now that their teammates back out in clean air, not really having to defend at all from Gilligan behind. And as they go up through this second sector then, tight and twisty here. We've seen a couple of moments for Ricciardo in combat earlier on where the back end of the car was starting to step out on them. Could be indicator of another low drag setup as well between those two cars. And so it's something that we will keep an eye on that gap as the race develops. But a little bit further up the field here, the two Mercedes cars have been dropped by the Red Bulls, just a bit further up the way, who have regained some time on the Ferraris. It's now the four of them up at the front of the order here, very close indeed, but even closer still is George Russell on the back of their teammate Lewis Hamilton, and just behind them, Fernando Alonso has somehow been able to keep that Alpine within DRS range, and so could potentially end up taking two positions here if the two Mercedes come together. Down the start finish straight we go then, on board with George Russell. They moved to the outside, but that gap was always going to close before they got there. And Hamilton then defending nicely into the first corner without having to deviate from their line too much. And so that means then it's going to be at least another couple of corners with them following their teammate here. But now, further back down the order, it's now Albon on both sides, surrounded three wide in towards turn number one. It's Kevin Magnussen, Zhou Guanyu, and Alex Albon all fighting one another. Surely Albon's not going to be able to hold this. He does! Alex Albon holds another position here. Seb Vettel is now sniffing around the back of Zhou Guanyu. I feel like he may have that as well. It's very close. No, Vettel tucked back in behind again. So Vettel clearly has got some pace in this Aston. I mean, clearly from the pace that Gilligan has been exhibiting, it's in the car. Clearly suits this particular circuit, and that's a handy thing given that one of their title sponsors is part of the oil refinery that is nearby, of course, and title sponsor of the race too. But looking at this then, as we go now to the lead battle, look at this. Carlos Sainz has been able to get past their teammate Charles Leclerc, but Leclerc now repasses the Spaniard. And as they head down into this back part of the circuit, then third sector, it's these Ferraris fighting one another so hard here. They are allowed to race in this early part of the season, we've been told by Mattia Binotto, but in doing so, look at this, Sergio Perez and Max Verstappen are now right there with them. In fact, they've been able to get past Charles Leclerc with Sergio Perez's car, and now as they head into the final turn then, Sainz needs to absolutely nail this exit to avoid being passed down the start-finish straight, and Leclerc needs to be able to make sure that they can get the march on Perez here. Down towards turn number one they go, then it looks like Sainz will be just far enough ahead where they won't be under too much threat, and it looks as though Leclerc has gone for the move, but is it going to work? Yes, they're going to send it all the way around the outside. Sergio Perez, and Perez, with a copy of the move that he pulled on his own teammate on lap one there, has to tuck back in behind the Ferrari. Now that gives a big, big gap now to Carlos Sainz. 1.2 seconds, that keeps him safe from the DRS of the cars behind. And that then means that Leclerc now has to act essentially as a bit of a rear gunner for his teammate to allow a little bit of a gap to open up. Go back now to the Mercedes duo, fighting there amongst themselves with Alonso lurking in the wings as well. And, well then, as they go down towards the hairpin, you can see here that Hamilton is continuing to just have a good bit of performance here, good run of form throughout this and the last race. Of course, bad qualifying for Hamilton last time round, starting in P14 in Bahrain, but they had managed to recover very well indeed, managed to get themselves back up inside the top six there, the top five even I should say, and well, it's looking like they're able to keep on terms with their teammate when they start in relatively similar parts of the circuit at the start of the race. So Perez chased by Verstappen, and then of course chasing Charles Leclerc. Let's see then, in this run up towards the final turn, will Perez have another attempt on Leclerc? It looks like they will, round the outside this time. And will they get all the way ahead before the braking zone? Yes, they do. So Perez goes round the outside of Charles Leclerc, but now it's going to be this run down the start-finish straight. And again, it looks like Leclerc maybe having a slightly better exit on traction there than Perez does. Perez not seeming to have a great deal of straight-line speed here, which is unusual, given what we saw for them last time out. But That being said, mistake from Perez into turn number 1 as well. It looked like they had that all sorted under control, but then a bit of a mistake just too late and too deep on the brakes there, and Charles Leclerc gets back past Sergio Perez. So then, it is Ferrari, Red Bull, Mercedes, and then comes a little bit more variation with Fernando Alonso in the Alpine, then the 2 McLarens, then Gilligan in the Aston, then Ocon, Schumacher, Bottas, Tsunoda, Gasly, Magnussen. I was about to say Albon, it's then Zhou Guanyu who's just gotten by Alex Albon. I wonder if that's going to stick for the first time in this race. And then just behind, no, Albon gets back past again on Zhou Guanyu, and then behind those 2 squabbling pair is then Sebastian Vettel and Nicholas Latifi. These cars that we're looking at just in front here, we've got Charles Leclerc, Sergio Perez, Max Verstappen, then all still very close together. And all this while, all this scrapping between them has allowed Carlos Sainz to now build up a 2.5 second lead to their teammate behind. And that is going to be of major benefit to them later on in this race, especially when we come time to things like pit stops and things like that. If there's a safety car, could give them a bit more options, in the way of options, I should say. And then look at this. Leclerc once again tries to defend to the inside, but on this DRS straight, it looks like Perez has much... Whoa! And Charles Leclerc, they put a big late braking maneuver on Hamilton and Bottas, I believe it was, in Bahrain last time out in the final corner. And they tried it once again on Perez here, but this time it hasn't really worked out for them. They get a bad exit onto the start-finish straight, and even with DRS, they get passed by Max Verstappen. So the Red Bulls both move on to the podium. And that then means Charles Leclerc has now got to try and keep themselves there. And look at the Mercedes pair now battling with one another. We've got Hamilton side by side with Russell. Hamilton has tried to send it round the outside in the next few corners. Through turn 4 they go. Hamilton with a bit of the back end kicking out there on them. And so that's then going to mean they're going to be compromised through these next couple of corners. And George Russell manages to get by the 7 times world champion. And up into P5. Good on George Russell there. And Hamilton now has got to gather themselves back up again and go after their teammate once more. But in all this scrapping, that gap from themselves back to Alonso has now shrunk from around about 9/10 of a second down to now just 4/10. So they need to be careful here that all this battling doesn't end up meaning they get separated and compromised and they end up having Alonso taking a position or 2 from them. Alonso seems to be so sufficiently competitive here, just in typical Fernando Alonso style, dragging a car way up the order to where it shouldn't really be, and making sure that they can be competing with the big boys of Formula 1. Certainly this team, the Mercedes team, have been the kings and queens of Formula 1 for the last several seasons, really, setting records and all the rest of it. And Verstappen, of course, then breaking that run of form last year as far as the Drivers' Championship was concerned, but Mercedes winning the Constructors. Hamilton now moves to the outside on the run down towards the final turn, and then he dips back behind at the DRS line. It's a good bit of racecraft there to be able to acknowledge that. We briefly then take a look to the Red Bull battle then. Verstappen versus Perez once again and again. Perez seems to have the upper hand on their teammate at this particular circuit. Verstappen tries to send it deep in turn 2. Doesn't work for them. Into turn 1 go the Mercedes pair, and Hamilton with the DRS hasn't been able to get by George Russell and tucks back in behind again. And Alonso is even closer now, just 0.3 of a second. Norris, Gilligan and Ocon all very close to the back of one another and to the back of Ricciardo in Norris's case. And that's then just going to mean that this particular battle might end up shifting up a gear or 2 as well. Tsunoda has also been able to make up a position on Mick Schumacher as well. The pair of them fighting hard. That's likely in the first couple of corners. And as Norris starts to chase down after Ricciardo, when we saw this earlier in the race, really, into this corner, this big long left-hander, turn 11. This is then one of those corners you can get alongside somebody, you can make the move happen, but realistically, only after a safety car restart or the start of the race. But look at this now. Back up to this fight for the podium places outside of the win here. 3.4 seconds now the gap from Carlos Sainz to Sergio Perez at the head of this small train here. And now DRS available once again for Max Verstappen and Charles Leclerc. Verstappen moves to the outside, trying to do what Perez did to Leclerc just a few laps ago, but he doesn't have the overspeed on him, but this time punching his teammate into the wall, or pinching his teammate I should say, but Perez is having none of it. Perez gets on by, and Verstappen and Leclerc both come into the pits. So this potentially an undercut here in operation to try and get them by Sergio Perez. Of course, when they come out of the pits, their tyres are going to be cold. Hamilton and Alonso both come in too, so that means that George Russell continues on. Daniel Ricciardo into the pits as well. Norris, Gilligan, Ocon continue. And Gilligan then has a bit of a look around the outside of Lando Norris, but Norris with some fantastic car position there stops Gilligan from getting a sniff in at either the outside or the inside in turns 1 and 2 respectively. And he's got to settle in for what is P5 currently, but of course after they make their pit stop, they will probably filter back down to around about that P10 that they were before all of this. So, keeping an eye on what's going on here, and the battling that we're seeing throughout the field. And speaking of battling throughout the field, Nicholas Latifi and Sebastian Vettel going side by side then, and Vettel going round the outside in turn number 4. You can see damage there on the left end plate on the front wing of Sebastian Vettel's car, so they are nursing an injury. Same thing happened to them in the last race, of course, if you remember. And so things have not been plain sailing for the 4 times world champion at the start of their second season with the Aston Martin team. That started life as Jordan, of course, then became Midland and Spiker, and then, of course, Force India, Racing Point, and now Aston Martin. And, of course, Vettel scoring Aston's one and only podium in Formula 1 last season at the Azerbaijan Grand Prix, and then almost getting a second podium in Hungary, but then, of course, disqualified after the race. Now then, Ocon has got that DRS flap open once again, so does Gilligan, but it looks as though Ocon has the overspeed here. They're going to have that opportunity, but no. They don't go for a move up the inside, instead they stick where they are. And now then, as they head round the final turn, again it will be both drivers with DRS here, and Gilligan opens it briefly coming into the pit lane. So just getting that extra little bit of speed there and opening up the tiniest of gaps to Ocon. As now he, Ocon and Norris all come into the pits, as does Carlos Sainz, so Ferrari electing to give Leclerc that opportunity to try and get back by the Red Bulls, and it looks as though for Sergio Perez they are safe for the time being. Now will that stay that way? Of course, because Perez now has the colder tyres. They will probably lose the back of their teammate here, but will Leclerc on those fresh, already warmed up tyres be able to close in now on the Red Bull? That's the question that we've got to keep an eye on the timing tower for. Fernando Alonso now very close to the back of George Russell. Russell has lost out immensely there through the lack of undercut to their teammate Lewis Hamilton. Hamilton now has a 1.8 second advantage over Russell, whereas Alonso now has a half-second gap to overcome. And with Russell no longer having DRS, it could be feasible that Alonso sends an attack on the young Brit here. We'll have to wait and see. Russell, of course, having several seasons at Williams before then joining the Mercedes team this season. And, they've already had one appearance for Mercedes, of course, at that Sakhir Grand Prix, where Sergio Perez got their first win in Formula 1. Coulda, shoulda, woulda, really, for George Russell that day. Could have been the ultimate super sub, where they could have come in and won the race. They got second in qualifying, managed to then race their heart out, was leading for most of the way there before then tragedy at the pit stops, which then shuffled them back down the order. Perez then on the back of Verstappen once again. So maybe this is not over between the Red Bull teammates, and Leclerc is trying the absolute best they can to get back onto terms with them. 1.8 seconds the gap, but now, as Perez opens up the DRS here, they're going to close in on Verstappen. They're not going to be close enough to actually make a move into turn 1 here, unless, of course, Verstappen has a very uncharacteristic mistake into that first turn. But things are looking very good for Sergio Perez so far. They've, of course, got second place last time out, behind Charles Leclerc, a race in which Verstappen and Sainz failed to score. And so if they're able to score very well today relative to Leclerc, they could take the championship lead here today. As it is, they would not be able to do that, but if they were to get past Verstappen, they could. And look at this now. Valtteri Bottas has turned up for the party, getting round the outside of Yuki Tsunoda into the first couple of corners. And now they're on the run down towards turn number 4. Then Tsunoda's got to be careful now of their teammate, Pierre Gasly, trying to come up there inside. But it looks as though they've been able to keep that sister AlphaTauri behind for the time being. Brief look at the driver's eye view there before we then go back to the main view from the over-the-shoulder cam on the run down towards turn number 11. So into the corner we go, through the big long banked left-hander here, and meanwhile further up the order then, as we had that brief scuffle there just outside the points, we now have the scuffle for the 2 lower spots on the podium. Perez once again is going to get that DRS open, and now it's going to be interesting to see whether or not Perez struggles to get by Verstappen in the same way that their teammates struggled behind them earlier on. So car 1 versus car number 11. Verstappen has closed down this gap to Sainz in front as well, 2.7 seconds now versus the over 3.5 seconds it was prior to the pit stop phases, of course, from Perez to Sainz as it was then. Ricciardo's gotten past Gilligan somewhere on the circuit, and down towards turn number 1 here we can see then that Perez again closer but not close enough. Looks like these Red Bulls very, very similarly matched as far as their pace is concerned, and perhaps very low drag setup, very low trim wing and things like that, so then the use of DRS is actually maybe not as powerful on their particular setup, on their particular car. DRS, of course, does become an awful lot more effective the more wing angle you run, because, of course, when you open up that wing, you're then dumping a lot more in the way of downforce and therefore drag, and therefore gaining the straight line speed. Gilligan has gotten themselves back past Ricciardo at some point on the lap. It's the battle of the Daniels at the moment, and as they go around here, crucially, of course, this is the battle for the final point. Aston Martin, with a car that we anticipate and we believe is not so well developed at this early point in the season. We analyse it as being only the second worst car on the grid at the moment in Formula 1, with Williams being the only one behind it in terms of a performance metric. But McLaren then, they're in a tight battle with Alpine at the moment, it seems, in terms of their own development war. And so as we watch this battle unfold, it's very important for both teams to try and score as many points as possible, especially given for McLaren at least, both of their rival team cars are both in the points at the moment. Alonso in 7th, Esteban Ocon in 9th, and Norris splitting the pair at the moment. So if Ricciardo is able to get up into P10 and just bag an extra point, it will just arrest slightly that lead that Alpine will generate over them in the point standings at the end of this race. And as we head into the final turn then, you can see there, Ricciardo was thinking about it, but Gilligan just cutting them off, making sure that they can close the door and say to them, look, you're not getting by me that easily. Down towards turn number 1 we go then, and once again it looks as though, similar to what we've been seeing with the Red Bull drivers, the Aston maybe trimmed out for a low drag setup here for Gilligan. So with DRS, Ricciardo wasn't really able to make that much of an impression. They're going to need to get this done somewhere where Gilligan's not expecting this, I think. Maybe in the corners possibly. And well then, back to this battle here, just a bit behind them, Tsunoda versus Bottas. Gasly then in the wings as well, with Mick Schumacher and Kevin Magnussen also having a little think about it. And then, oh, look at that, Bottas then not taking any prisoners at all. Bottas, who's been rejuvenated, it seems, by their switch to Alfa Romeo. Of course, a very successful driver at Mercedes, but could never really demonstrate the same amount of pace as Lewis Hamilton. Look at this, Mick Schumacher up the inside in turn number 11 there, getting their car alongside Pierre Gasly. And hopefully now for Mick Schumacher, they can get the power down, but no. Gasly's able to get themselves back by. They're now going to make this run down towards the next corner, and we jump to the Red Bulls instead. Sergio Perez briefly alongside, and now then Verstappen versus Perez, wheel-to-wheel contact between the drivers again. They are not pulling their punches between the Red Bulls, and now then as they go down the start-finish straight, it's going to be no DRS for either car. So either there's a problem on one of the cars as far as DRS is concerned, or they were at the exact same spot as they went across the timing line or the detection line. Now then, through turn number 2 then, Perez has the inside line. It's going to be very close here, but now as they go down towards turn number 4, we've seen cars make it around the outside here today. Will Perez do the same again? Bit of a step out at the back end of the car there. It means that Verstappen's going to try and get alongside them here. Will Perez be able to hang it around the outside? It looks like they might be able to do so, but no! Verstappen cuts them off, and that then drops them back towards Charles Leclerc. The Monegasque driver is getting closer and closer, spying an opportunity to get themselves back up into P2, never mind just back into 3rd and onto the podium. And Fernando Alonso, definitely one of the drivers of the day here today. They have stuck with the Mercedes of George Russell since the very start of this one, and are making some very, very good inroads towards a great result here for their Alpine team. The Enstone team, of course, that they won their 2 championships with back in 2005 and 2006, and a team which they feel they can win one more with. It is, of course, the Renault factory team. It is a team that is on the ascendancy in Formula 1 after a couple of years of a bit of a false dawn back in 2018, and then being unseated from that best of the rest position by their then customer McLaren. McLaren, of course, since then going to Mercedes engines and finding even more success, but this season starting the new regulations on the back foot. And speaking of the back foot, Max Verstappen then in 2nd place, but not for much longer. Sergio Perez gets alongside them again. Neither Red Bull has the DRS open on the back of their car there. And Perez is getting just ever so slightly further ahead, and they are now a full car length ahead. And now Verstappen's got to defend to the inside as well from Charles Leclerc. Leclerc gets up the inside into the next couple of corners, and now they're going to have this run potentially down towards turn number 4. No, Verstappen is able to just get on traction a little bit better and get back ahead of the Ferrari. Then we'll have seen that Perez has gotten by. It could be that Verstappen then is the one with a DRS issue. because we've seen it working on Perez's car. So for it not to be working on either Red Bull down the start-finish straight, it would therefore be perhaps a fair assumption to make that it is a problem on Verstappen's car. And Verstappen now has even lost some more time to Perez then. It's now more than a second between the two of them, and the Ferrari looked a lot more convincing in a straight line than the Red Bull did earlier on in this race. And so I would imagine then this is going to be an easy move for Charles Leclerc, getting down the next few corners. And then the question will be whether they can then get on after Perez in the next few corners. So Verstappen's been able to gain time through the corners here, which lends to the theory that the Red Bull is perhaps going a little bit more downforce than the Ferrari. And Leclerc then has just been able to stick with them the whole time. Now let's see then where Leclerc goes here. Do they go for the inside or the outside? The Verstappen's DRS is working again. You can see that rear wing open then. Drag reduction system for those of you new to Formula 1. And, ooh, would you look at that there? I think it was maybe contact with the wall there from one or both of those drivers as they tried to turn the car and get it straightened up as much as possible for maximum exit speed. Slow in, fast out is the methodology in Formula 1, of course. Now then, Leclerc goes to the outside, down the start-finish straight. Once again, tries and get by Verstappen, making more wheel-to-wheel contact with another car here today. It was first their teammate, now it's Leclerc. And Verstappen takes a much, much wider line in turn number 2, able to then cut back through 3. And now on the run down here into 4, they're well ahead of Charles Leclerc once again. Throughout all of this, Hamilton has been gaining time too. Not by much, they're still a bit further distance back, and Ocon now has also been able to gain time and gain a position, in fact. Seems to be at the start of their stints here. Ocon is doing very well indeed on those tyres, and then it was maybe in the middle or the end of their stints is where things were then falling off for them, certainly the first stint at least. We'll now wait and see if Norris is able to respond in the coming laps here. But good move from Esteban Ocon up the inside in turn number 4. And, well, that's something which Charles Leclerc might need a little bit of help with there if they're able to get themselves alongside into that particular corner. Norris now will chase Ocon down in towards turn number 11 then, and in the background you can see there Gilligan is now 1.3 seconds ahead of Daniel Ricciardo, so they're not at threat of a DRS pass anytime soon, unless of course they make a mistake or Ricciardo is able to suddenly get the hammer down. But Norris then, of course, multiple podium winner in Formula 1. Esteban Ocon just has the one podium, but it's the important one. It was his first win at the Hungaroring last year. And so two very highly skilled, young and hungry drivers. Ocon, of course, starting his career at the then Force India, I should say, later Racing Point. And then, of course, taking a year on the sidelines in 2021. Now then, look at this. Charles Leclerc versus Max Verstappen. The latest round here, and this time Leclerc has the inside into turn 1, then the outside in turn 2, and then what will be the inside in turn number 3, and then on the run down to turn number 4, Charles Leclerc has the move done, and they can get themselves on and chasing after Sergio Perez, who has not been able to respond at all to the pace of Carlos Sainz at the front of this race. 5.7 seconds now the lead between those two cars, and once again then, it is close between Lando Norris and Esteban Ocon. This time much closer on the run down towards turn number 4. Will Norris try a late braking manoeuvre to get around the outside here in turn 4? It looks like it. They try it through 5 and now 6. It's very close indeed. Then 7, 8, 9 is coming up here, and then 10, the left-handed flick before we make that run down towards turn number 11. This great big hairpin that then comes at you at high speed with that banking as well to try and promote more racing and more overtaking. And as it is then, Norris and Ocon very close in their fight at the moment. Going to be more DRS opportunities for Norris though on this lap, and they will then be able to mount another fight against Ocon here. So this battle is certainly not done for the moment. Further up the field though by 10.8 seconds is Fernando Alonso. Still sticking with George Russell, 6/10 the gap still between those two cars. So Alonso not really losing anything, but not really gaining too much either at the same time. So perhaps it could just be the wily old fox is building up their battery, maybe getting ready to make that move later on. But we'll wait and see. Now then, Norris has the DRS open, and this is going to be one of those late braking maneuvers, I think. So in towards the final turn they go. Side-by-side contact between the two cars. A bit of a puff of smoke you could see there from Esteban Ocon's brakes too on the front right corner. Leclerc has been able to defend their position from Verstappen, and whilst we were looking away at that, Lando Norris has driven round the outside of Esteban Ocon at the final turn and has now gotten that position on lock in towards turn number 1. So great move there from Lando Norris. And now Esteban Ocon is going to tuck in behind and try and stick with the McLaren driver. Meanwhile, just behind, 1.4 seconds now the gap between Gilligan and Ocon, so the two squabbling amongst themselves here has allowed Gilligan to get that bit closer. And Ricciardo is closer to them still. 1 second now separating Gilligan and Ricciardo. It dips now under a second. So Gilligan now at threat from DRS passes once again then. Ocon then 6/10 behind Lando Norris. This fight for the lower points paying positions then could be crucial by the end of the season. We don't know just yet, but of course it's early days, only the second round of a 22 race season. And with all that has been shown so far, it looks like we're in for one hell of a season. These new cars definitely allowing the drivers to race one another much better than they used to. And once again then, it looks like we're going to have another scrap between Leclerc and Verstappen. Two drivers who are absolutely top of their games, and in seasons past, you might say, were the drivers to look for in their respective teams. Leclerc the faster at Ferrari, even when Sebastian Vettel was there, and then Verstappen, of course, having dominated Sergio Perez last season. But at the moment, both of them being beaten by their supposed number 2 teammates. Now then, Alonso is getting a bit more feisty versus George Russell here. The gap now just down to 1/10 of a second as Alonso thought about it around the outside in turn number 1 before he was cut off by George Russell, and now his teammate Esteban Ocon is thinking about doing something similar with Lando Norris. Norris has the inside in turn 1, outside in turn number 2 then, but there's a bit more grip out there it seems, and so now then inside of 3, down towards 4, and Norris is ahead. They are defending the inside of it, driving the middle of the road, but they return to the racing line and stay ahead of Esteban Ocon. That has allowed Gilligan now to get within DRS range of the Alpine. You can see there then on board with the Aston Martin that they're struggling a bit more in these corners here, but then on the straights it looks as though that's where that car really is benefiting. Also very low ERS percentage there, just dipping under 10%, you can see on the dashboard there. Great that in these nighttime race conditions we can see that on the dashboard very easily. We don't get the reflections off of the dash as you would see during daytime racing. And Gilligan then having another very, very strong race in a car which once again should not really be competing this high based on the performance. And Seb Vettel, of course, much further down the order. We suspect that's something to do with a pit stop to get themselves off of the broken front wing. And meanwhile, it is Leclerc versus Verstappen once again, and Verstappen this time is able to send it round the outside in the final corner. They're able to just squeeze Leclerc in towards that inside barrier. We've seen that move a couple of times now from them, and that is a good way of being able to essentially disarm your opponent. They can't then get a good drive at that final turn. And look at this then, Norris versus Ocon again, and it looks like Norris rather, ends up getting the same treatment as Leclerc, so they now are forced to the inside. They don't have their DRS open, and neither does Esteban Ocon, so it's shut for both drivers then, also shut for Gilligan as well. So is there a mass problem with DRS, possibly? And Ocon! Ocon goes far too deep into the first corner then, and that then means that Norris sends it back round there outside in turn number 2, and Gilligan is now having a think as well. It's not going to be 3 wide, no, Gilligan backs out of the move then, is thinking about taking advantage of these two when they maybe end up having a bit of a coming together, but it doesn't end up happening. Instead, Ocon gets back by Norris, and Gilligan has got to simply tuck in behind for now, wait for their opportunity to come. And I must say though, I feel like that was one of the better opportunities that come knocking when your rivals are just that bit closer to one another and getting each other offline like that, whereas you can then keep that optimal racing line, carry the speed through. And as it is then, Gilligan in that yellow, white and blue helmet is able to keep pushing on and try and get themselves within touching distance of Lando Norris. I mean, they are almost within touching distance, they're 4/10 back, but Ricciardo is even closer, just 1.3 tenths. And then look at this then, so onto the back of Gilligan, both cars with DRS, so there's not really much to be gained or lost at this stage. And now then, as they go through towards this final DRS straight on the run down towards the final corner, it looks like Ricciardo now is going to have a bit more of a look here. Gilligan is going to try and defend this as best as they can, of course, wants to keep that solitary point for Aston Martin here today. And with all that's been going on in this race, has been so exciting that we're now on to the 23rd lap of 25. So this battle then can't go on for too much longer. They're all on the lead lap. Carlos Sainz has not lapped these drivers. And as we go down towards the next few corners then, we've got into turn 1. Norris is not close enough to Ocon to make the move. Gilligan in turn not close enough to Norris, and Ricciardo not close enough to Gilligan. Things very close between these four drivers, and it's been fascinating to watch the battle, see where the cars are stronger and where they're weaker. There's undeniably a disadvantage for the Aston Martin through the corners, whether that's down to just pure car performance or also that there is a light drag setup on that car as well, and therefore low downforce, we're not too sure. Leclerc versus Verstappen once again as they head on through. Further up the road, Carlos Sainz has started the 24th lap of this Grand Prix, and Esteban Ocon retires from the Grand Prix. Esteban Ocon with a spectacular old school engine failure, smoke billowing out the back of that Alpine. Renault have just the one team they're supplying this season, that is their Works Alpine team, and so not much data to be going off of versus some of their rivals, particularly the Mercedes-powered teams, of which there are four, of course. Mercedes, McLaren, Aston Martin and Williams, of course. And so there is a failure for them. That could be crucial in the championship later on. That means both McLarens are now in point scoring contention here. Charles Leclerc trying to send it round the outside in turn 1, up the inside in turn 2. But Verstappen is there round the outside, keeping that Red Bull planted. Lap 25 now. Carlos Sainz has started our final lap of the Grand Prix. And so as we watch these guys continue to circulate round, Leclerc is going to know it is now or never in terms of getting this race done and won. As far as a step on the podium is concerned, at least. Meanwhile, for Gilligan, they have had a look there briefly up the inside of Norris, very close to the back of the McLaren, into turn number 1 and 2. And now then, they're going to chase on after them, hoping to get that extra few more points. Of course, they've now doubled their points haul. Go from 1 point up to 2 now for finishing in 9th place. And, well, given that they started in P14, this is a great result for them in this race. Hamilton up in P5 there under no threat at all from the car behind or in front. And then Leclerc versus Verstappen. This is this close battle worth keeping an eye on the circuit. And Alonso as well has also been able to get that move done on George Russell at some point as well. So Fernando Alonso is currently beating one of the Works Mercedes cars. Now if he can keep that one ahead to the checkered flag, that will be a brilliant result for the Alpine driver. Taking on 8 points if they're able to get that. But across the line for the first time in Formula 1, Carlos Sainz wins the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. Sergio Perez comes home second. It looks like we have a new Spanish matador in Formula 1. Across the line comes Max Verstappen, holding off Charles Leclerc by just 2.5 tenths in the end. Lewis Hamilton comes across the line, P5. And the old bull, the old matador, comes across the line, P6 ahead of George Russell. Fernando Alonso take a bow. Just behind them, you then got Lando Norris in P8, and then Daniel Gilligan will follow them home. The Aston Martin taking home P9 in this race. Great result for them and their team. Daniel Ricciardo scores one single solitary point for the McLaren team as well. And then it will be Yuki Tsunoda, Valtteri Bottas, Pierre Gasly, Kevin Magnussen, Mick Schumacher, Zhou Guanyu, Alex Albon, Sebastian Vettel, and then of course Esteban Ocon and Nicholas Latifi will not finish. Or rather, Ocon will not finish and Latifi will finish a lap down. So, scenes of jubilation in the Ferrari garage. It is 2 from 2 for them, but for 2 different drivers. Carlos Sainz then taking their very first win here in Formula 1. And you can see then just how excited they are at that prospect. They point to their chest, point to the badge, and then the emotion flows. Look at them now embracing their team. You can see the exultation there from the Ferrari mechanics. Red Bull taking a solid 2nd and 3rd in this one, and that means that Sergio Perez now takes the lead of the Drivers' Championship. So then, as they head out onto the podium, for the first time he can stand on the top step. He came close once in Monza, right behind Pierre Gasly when he was at McLaren, but this time he's gone one better in the Ferrari. Carlos Sainz is a race winner in Formula 1. We want to thank you very much for watching this second round of the season. We will be back on Saturday for round number 3, the Australian Grand Prix, of course, when we go down under to the remodelled and reprofiled Melbourne Albert Park circuit. In the meantime, give us a follow, give us a subscribe, like the video, and we'll see you next time.